Hi, this is Joseph. Welcome back. Today I'm going to be covering section 6.6, argument, forms, and fallacies from the chapter 6, propositional logic. So we're in Hurley's Introduction to Logic, 13th edition, and let's get at it. Okay, so this is a longer section. So if you're taking my class, I break it up into two sections, but this video will cover both sections. So it'll cover the whole all of 6.6. Okay, so let's dive right into it. This chapter is all about form recognition. You don't have to do any truth tables. You just have to, ask yourself, what am I looking at? What form is this argument in? And he gets specific. There's 8 valid forms and 2 invalid forms, and I'll go over all those. So you could think of this section as actually a review from chapter 1 and chapter 6. So you've been doing, you might say, these type of homework problems, you've actually been doing this in the previous sections. You've already been translating, you've already been using logical operators. So you've been seeing these patterns, and you know the names of these from chapter 1. So now it all comes together. All right, so 6 valid argument forms. So we'll just do a brief read along with Hurley here. In section 6.2, we define a statement form as an arrangement of statement variables and operators such that a uniform substitution of statements in place of variable results in a statement. Okay, we got that. An example of a statement form is P.Q, where P and Q are statement variables. Analogously, an argument form is an arrangement of statement variables and operators such that the uniform substitution of statements. Let me read. Yeah, this is just, let me highlight this part here. So if you're following along in the Mind tab or the text, and if you're driving in your car, that's fine. Basically, you just have to recognize the argument forms. Again, 8 of them, 6 good, 2 bad, and I'll even sneak in a third-ish there, so it'll be like 9. 6 good, 3 bad, but one of them doesn't have a name, but I'll show you. Okay, so let me scroll up here. Okay, so these parts don't matter. Yeah, we'll just go straight to the first one. Okay, so the 6 good ones have names. Again, chapter 1 review. Modus, ponens. So there's the form of it, right? If P then Q, we have P, therefore we have Q. So again, this is premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. And I'll even write it down. Give me a second here. Just this. Okay. All right, so I did not know that I could. Oh, give me a second here. Oh, I'm going to close that bad boy. Okay, so that's modus ponens. Very straightforward. And then he gives you an example with the English. If 12 million children die yearly from starvation, comma, then. So we know we have triggers that we're looking for. If, then, right? So we represent them T and S over here to the right. Again, premise. I'll do this. Let's see if this works. Yeah. Premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. So if T then S, we have T, therefore we have S, and it's an argument. It's valid. And we saw in sections 6.4 why it was valid, because we can't find a line on the truth table. So just review. Let's do this. How many propositions here? 2. How many lines on the truth table? 4. Just giving you time to think about it. 4 lines on the truth table. And what you have to do is find out, when you have true premises, do you have a false conclusion? And there's nowhere on this truth table where that occurs. Therefore, This is a bulletproof, valid argument form, and the name is Modus ponens. So and by the way, some of the greatest philosophy papers that have ever been written have used real simple argument forms like modus ponens. You might construct your entire paper around proving premise 1 and 2, and therefore you have your conclusion. So anyways, that's one argument form. Again, do the letters matter? No. Watch over here. Is that a modus ponens? Yes. Different letters, right? It turns out you could actually, watch this. If psi, then chi. We have psi, therefore we have chi. These are Greek letters, right? It doesn't even matter. You could use stars, diamonds, whatever these represent, whether you have A, B, C's, psi's, or whatever, they always represent something. Well, up here, RT and RS represent something, right? RT represents 12 million children die yearly from starvation. What's our S represent? Our S represents something is wrong with food distribution. So it doesn't matter if you use letters or symbols, they're going to represent some sort of language, meaning, right? Okay, so let's go. Modus tollens. Let me get out of this right here. And modus tollens looks similar to, give me a sec. It looks similar to modus ponens. It has an if-then statement on the first premise, right? But what's the difference? It negates the consequent of premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. And I could put P1, P2. So you could see this as something else, right? You can see it a couple different ways, but either way, you have a conditional. So you have your antecedent. I won't confuse you. If I put an A, you'll think it's a different. So yeah, the first part is antecedent. Second part, consequent. You can go back to chapter 1 and review this, your conditionals. And then what you do is you deny the consequent. That's what you're doing here. You have a B, right? So on the bottom on premise 2, you're saying not B. Whatever B is, not B. Then you're saying whatever A is up here in your antecedent, your conclusion's not A. So this, another example, and just as review, if you saw it this way, because remember, we can write it this way as well, right? We can write premise 1, premise 2, and then conclusion with the double lines. We just saw that in 6.4 and 6.5. So you will never see an instance, and again, this is 2 propositions, right? 4 lines on a truth table. You got to do a truth table, not here, but in the past you would, right? To find out, like, well, why is this valid? You would never have a truth table that shows two true premises and a false conclusion. That just will not happen. That's why this modus tollens is another bulletproof, valid argument. And what that means is this. It has perfect structure. That means if you have good meaning, good definitions, or good whatever you insert into the, whatever your P and Q's equal, if they have good, oh geez, I don't know what that was. Let me go back. Oh, that's interesting. I have no idea what I did, but I shifted some of my content by pushing something. That's all right. We'll get rid of all this. Wow, what a mess. Okay, doesn't even matter. Okay, so again, we're talking about bulletproof valid argument. So there's another form. You can see it with multiple different letters. And just to let you know, and this is why it's one of my favorite, this is what Socrates used often. When he was talking with people, he'd say, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by courage? What do you mean by virtue? What do you mean by art? Like anything you wanted to define, he'd say, what do you mean? And he'd start questioning it. And if he found a contradiction in your thought, meaning if he found something that didn't line up, like a Q and a not Q, he would say, hey, therefore, this original position you started with, it turns out it's false. Let's start all over again. So me personally, I love this argument form. I use it in a lot of papers that I write. So yeah, okay, so that's one form. That's two forms. We have modus ponens, we have modus tollens. Now let's go to, and he gives you an example. He just says, look, C and an S, not S, therefore not C, and he gives you, your meaning and all that kind of stuff right here. It's about killing whales in Japan. So let's go on to the next one. Pure hypothetical syllogism. So this one's easy because premise 1, premise 2, and conclusion, you'll have three conditionals. Each one of these has this symbol. So again, this is about pattern recognition, your homework. Modus tollens has how many conditionals? One conditional. What about, that was it. Let me see. I feel like I can get rid of, there it is. Yes, I did it. I got rid of that previous inked out stuff. Okay. How many conditionals in your modus ponens? One. Hypothetical syllogism does not have one. It has how many? Three. Okay. So he'll give you an example. Say, if the world, blah, 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 then cities, and then if cities, then pollution, and therefore if pollution, then pollution. So he goes on and on. So what you're looking for in this is for these to line up. You have an antecedent, which is W, in this premise 1. You have an antecedent, which is a W, and then you have a consequent, which is a C. And what we'll do when it drops down the second line, they will line up. You'll have two C's, they connect, therefore you can conclude the W and the P, which you do here. Okay? A lot of you might remember this in math. When you're proving something and then you have a connection and then you can I'm thinking I don't know why it's skipping my mind. Anyways, okay, so that's the third example. You have three conditionals. You can't just have three conditionals, by the way. You have to have, we'll use different letters. You have to have the consequent up here line up with the antecedent. And then you conclude the A and the C. Okay, so in the hypothetical syllogism, you will have, and this is another good note, you will have three propositions, three different letters. Notice we have the P, the Q, and the R. See that? Three different letters, three propositions, three conditionals lined up in the right way. How many did we have in the modus tollens? Only had two propositions. How many did we have in the modus ponens? Only two. Again, pattern recognition. When you get to your homework, I'm going to be asking you this stuff. Okay, so disjunctive syllogism, super easy. How many propositions do we have here? Two. Two props. We're moving out of the, for this one, we're moving out of the conditional, the horseshoe symbol, and now we have the disjunctive symbol. So on this one, P or Q, not P, therefore Q. Here's something that I want you to see. Trips up a lot of students, right? P or Q. You have option, think of it this way. Option 1, or, because that's what the wedge means, right? Or option 2. I'm giving you two options in premise 1. P or Q, A or B, C or D, whatever letters you want to use, right? And I'm going to say over here, I'm denying one of those. I am literally saying tilde, denying one of them. We'll just pick, and he picks P, right? If I deny one of the options, I have the other option, because that's what he shows you over here. So if some of you see two options, but it's not denying one of them on the second premise, it's not a disjunctive syllogism. The disjunctive syllogism, in order for it to work, again, I'll give you another example. You have to have two choices, C or D. It has to, what? To one of them? Okay, so premise one has this, right? What does premise have to do to one of them? That's right, deny. Pick one. C or D, right? We'll deny D, right? So therefore you bring down C. That's it. So that's for disjunctive syllogism. Make sure you have a tilde in your second premise. If you do not, it is not a disjunctive syllogism. Okay. And then he gives you an example. Either Harvard or Princeton. Not Harvard. So therefore Princeton. And he's talking about New Jersey. All right. So, this is a good one right here. So see this example here? Let's just say this is premise one, premise two. You don't have to know anything about this stuff over here. You could just look at the form. Is he denying something in the second premise? No. Therefore, it is invalid. Right away, we know that it's not valid. It is not a disjunctive syllogism, right? Because we have to deny something in the second premise, which we did there. He's giving you an example saying, look, we didn't deny anything. In fact, like, it may be the case that you have H or A. It may be the case that you have A. But you can't conclude from that you have not A. You can't do that. Okay, so there's no tilde before that H. That's why it's invalid, okay? Again, pattern recognition. Constructive dilemma. So, okay, how many do we have so far? I think we have 4. Yes, modus ponens, modus tollens, they both have 2 propositions. Sorry about that. Pure hypothetical syllogism has 3 propositions. Oh, and just a mental note, this is called, you'll love this, pure hypothetical syllogism. These are called impure. You saw this in chapter 1. And it just has something to do with the premise 1 having one conditional and the second premise not having a conditional. So they call it impure, which is the modus tollens and the modus ponens. That's just for your information. Okay, so yes, that's 4 because we have the disjunctive syllogism coming in at a hot 4. Now, 5 and 6, they're lengthy, right? But again, we're looking for pattern recognition. Constructive dilemma. Constructive dilemma, go straight to the form. Okay, so you have premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. And all you have to know is that premise 1 has 2 conditionals, right? 2 conditionals. And what's in between them is conjunction. So, and then the second one is a simple disjunction, PR, and then the conclusion is a disjunction. So if you were to simply see this like this in your mind, you're looking for pattern recognition. Premise 1 will have 2 conditionals, and they're separated, right, by parentheses, and you'll have a dot in the middle and then a wedge. Okay, so again, if you were to take this, and by the way, how many propositions does this have? I have a P, Q, R, S, 4. Ooh. How many lines on the truth table? Yes. So in order to find out whether this is valid or not, you'd have to do a 16-line truth table, and we won't do that. But on this truth table, you will never find where premise 1 is true, premise 2 is true, and the conclusion is false. You will never find that. You will always find when you have 2 true premises, you will have a true conclusion. That's why it's valid. So we don't need to see why that's the case, but it goes without saying, because you could do the truth table and you could look it up for yourself. But Hurley's just saying, hey, there are 6 bulletproof valid forms in this section, and he's trying to show you this is what it would look like. You don't even have to know anything about the word meaning here. You would just be able to look for trigger words like if, then, but. We remember but can be symbolized as a conjunction. And then, then we have our another if then here. So that would be like this. That would be like this right here. The but would symbolize this, and another if then. And then premise 2. We must choose either, whatever. And then we have our either or. We know that's a wedge. And then we have another either or. So we know that's a wedge. And we know that this is our conclusion because of that therefore. Okay, so if you were to read through this, you're looking through trigger words. So there you go. And that's the constructive dilemma. The destructive dilemma is a little different. You have what looks like the same kind of pattern for that first premise, but the second premise is denying the antecedents of both. In fact, let's look up. The constructive dilemma, premise 1, okay, looks exactly the same as the destructive dilemma. Premise 2 affirms both antecedents, the P and the R, they drop down, P and the R, into the wedge, okay? And then you conclude the consequences of both. So the Q and S drop down to the conclusion, right? Notice what this one does. The destructive dilemma denies both the consequence right away, denies them in premise 2, and it concludes the denial of both of the antecedents. Reminds you of a modus tollens, doesn't it? The one that did like this. You deny the consequent, then you deny the antecedent. But you're doing more than that here. So again, just like the constructive dilemma, you have how many propositions? 4, 16 lines in a truth table. A lot of work to figure out why that's valid, but we know that it is. And that's the form that it would look like. Now, it turns out constructive and destructive dilemmas are used a lot in debate. But that's going to take me outside the scope of my lecture today. We're not going to get into what you'll see coming up is horns in the dilemma and how you get through these. But it's fascinating, really fascinating how this is used in debate. But anyways, that's the practical import. Yeah, it turns out logic is very useful. And it's used in debate. Lawyers use it to convince juries, depending on the sophistication of argument forms. They could use, think of it like Batman. He's got a bunch of tools on his belt. And think of it like he wants to take down a robber, right? And Batman's like, for this one, all I need is like disjunctive syllogism, something real easy. But for the super corrupt banker, he's like, I'm going to pull out a constructive dilemma, or destructive dilemma, something really sophisticated. That's kind of how logic works. Because some of you might be thinking, well, which argument form do I use? There's a bunch of going on. Well, I don't know. It depends. Depends on what you want to do. And by the way, some argument forms can be translated into another one. So I might take an argument that I can have in a destructive dilemma, and I might use the same thing in a modus ponens. It all depends on your flavor. But either way, each form is distinct, and they look different. But anyways, that's beyond the scope of this lecture. That gets a little bit more advanced. All right, so 2 invalid forms. So we just covered the 6 valid forms. Here's the 2 invalid. They have names, affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent. These are both real tricky. They look like modus ponens and like modus tollens, but they're not. Okay? Affirming the consequent. So remember, for review, which one was this one? We just covered it up above. It was valid. If we have P, then we have Q. We have P, therefore we have Q. This was a modus ponens. What about this one? Oh, sorry. We have P, we have Q, we have not Q, therefore we have not P. That's modus tollens. This one looks familiar, right? So on the first one, we have a conditional. It's like, if P, then Q. We have Q, therefore we have P. It kind of looks like a modus tollens, except for there's something missing. We don't have the tildes. And that's why this thing doesn't work. You can see this in your mind by looking at the English down here with Napoleon, or you can do we have two propositions, 4-line truth table. You could do a truth table, and you will find an instance of both premises being true and the conclusion being false. And that right there was enough to warrant that the whole thing was what? Invalid. So again, that's just what it looks like. If you have P and you have Q, he brings down the consequent per line 2, and then he affirms the antecedent. So that's the form. If you want to know the why it's invalid, do a truth table. If you just want to recognize a form, that's it. Could you see it this way? Another way? Sure. That's invalid. Just using different letters, okay? And notice that is different from the ones that are valid up here. Because again, this isn't using a negation, but it's bringing down the antecedent. But over here, this is bringing down the consequent. All right, let's go on. Denying the antecedent. So yeah, this one is called affirming the consequent. So once again, if P, then Q, it's bringing down the consequent, or it's affirming it. It's saying, hey, I'm going to affirm it. I'm going to say that the consequent's true, and then I'm going to affirm the antecedent. Turns out you can't do that. You have to affirm the antecedent first, then you can affirm the consequent. And that's what we did up here in the modus ponens. Okay. Denying the antecedent. So if P, then Q, not P, therefore not Q. What he's doing, this looks similar to a modus tollens, which would look like this. The only problem is they're not denying the consequent, they're denying the antecedent right away, and that's where you run into a problem on the truth table. So we could find an example of where this premise is true, this is true, and this is false. Okay, so that's it. You can see it in a different form if you want. So whenever you see something like this, it doesn't work, it's invalid, it's denying the antecedent. You're not allowed to deny the antecedent. So we've covered 8 forms right now. 6 good, they all have names. 2 bad. Here's a third I'm going to throw on. Actually, I will do it later on because he'll show you a chart. Refuting constructive and destructive dilemmas. I'm not worried about that for this. It talks about grasping the horns or escaping the horns. This is all really fascinating and awesome, but I don't cover that in my homework. So don't worry about this. But again, if you want to get into argument and debate, or part of the debate team, you want to come right back here and read this. There's even a movie with Denzel Washington. It's about debate. It is awesome. I think he's a debate coach. Oh, you'll love it. So anyways, they talk about how they debate. But I think of that movie when I think of grasping the horns, escaping the horns, because a lot of that is not being said on stage, but it's what's happening. When people are battling back and forth using logic, and they're not saying we're using logic, we're using disjunctive, so they're not saying any of that, but that's what's happening. They're using argument forms and they're supporting the premises. And when they support them and they have the right form, the conclusion is forced upon you. And that's what happens in debate. So you have to look for ways to deny. And that's what they're basically saying with the constructive and destructive dilemma. Here's one way of doing it. Here's option 1. Here's option 2. Okay. And we've learned in chapter 3 that there's something called false dichotomy, where you show that you have 2 sides and only 2. So choose one. The false dichotomy says, no, man, there's more than 2 sides. I can think of a third or a fourth or a fifth. But anyways, I'm getting off track. So let's go back down. Yeah, I won't look at all that stuff. There's a chart that I'm getting at. Here you go. Okay, summary and application. So we have modus ponens, that's 1. Modus tollens, 2. Hypothetical syllogism, 3. Disjunctive syllogism, 4. Constructive dilemma, 5. Destructive dilemma, 6. These are all what? These are all valid. They're the good forms. Then he says, hey, here's 7 and 8. These are the invalid or bad forms, and they have names, denying the antecedent. So you could symbolize this as a DA, AC, instead of spelling it out. You could just put DD, CD, HS, whatever. But you know what it stands for. Like MT stands for modus tollens. So however your homework is formatted. For example, if I'm requiring you to work through the book and you have to type this out, then you would simply put MT. You don't have to spell the whole thing out. If you're using MindTap, it has its own format. If you're driving in the car and you're listening along and you just want to learn more about logic, either one. But at that point, you're not going to want to tell somebody, hey, I know what MT means. They're going to be like, what are you talking about? You're just going to want to say modus tollens, or modus tollens, excuse me. All right, so we'll come down. And, this is one thing. I'll throw a third. This is what I want to show you. So it doesn't give a name, but I'll throw a third on here, A or B. And let's say I have an A and I say something like B. It looks like it's a disjunctive syllogism, right? Because I have premise 1, which has a wedge, premise 2, which has a letter, and then a conclusion. But again, I have no tilde. There's no tilde there. So I would just say, this is the one that could be common in your homework, but it's invalid, but it has no name. But it looks like this. But you can't say invalid disjunctive syllogism. No. Disjunctive syllogism is all by itself valid. You can't say invalid disjunctive syllogism because it looks like one. You just have to say invalid. Okay? That's why I go at great lengths to map that out. Because if you were to say this, that would be wrong. You would have to say invalid or disjunctive syllogism. The disjunctive syllogism itself is valid. And if you have something that looks like it, it's just not. Okay? So you can't combine those two terms. You can't say DS invalid. It's either DS valid or invalid all on its own. So it's pretty much you have that. But a lot of students say something like this because it looks like the disjunctive syllogism. All right, so that's it for that. He tells you, he goes down and he gives us another rule, commutativity, and let me see, let me get to it. Yeah, double negation and commutativity. So in short, I'm going to make it really short, not too hard here. Double negation is this. If I have a not P, that's the same as P. All right? So basically, I'll go over here. Let's say I start with this and I add a tilde to it. So a double tilde is just the same as P. But what about this? What about if I had 1, 2, 3? What would it be? Well, 2 of these block out, so it's just a P, so then I would just have this. And don't overthink that. It just says double negation is equal. So you can see right here, P is logically equivalent to not P. So I like to make fun of this. We'll use redneck terminology. Let's say my wife says, hey, did you mow the lawn? And I said, I'm not going to go out there and mow that lawn. Now, if I said, I'm not going to go do that, what am I saying? I'm going to go do that. That's why I say it's redneck logic. It's pretty hilarious. So, but what if I were to say, I'm not going to go out there and mow that lawn? That means I'm not going to go out there and mow it because there's 3 negatives. You could think about that. But that's it. Double negation rule. So you might say some of these forms, if you see this, it's the same as this. But okay, commutativity, real easy. P and Q is logically equivalent to Q and P, and it just means this. You can reverse whatever's on the side of the wedge, or even this. So let's say I have an A and a B. It's the same thing as a B and an A. Like, it doesn't matter what order it comes in. A dot B or B dot A, same thing. That's all those rules are telling you. Commutativity is telling you can reverse these guys here. Double negation saying, hey, if you have 2 negatives, it's the same as a positive. Done. And why do I say that? Because of pattern recognition in your homework. You're going to have to recognize certain patterns. And it may be that you have to add one of those rules to it, double negation or commutativity, to see the pattern emerge. But let's go down. And then he does it again. Repetition. He's saying, hey, again. There's he's giving you examples, but I'll just do this. I'll just say that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those were all good forms. And then denying the antecedent, that would be 7. Affirming the consequent, that'd be 8. And then he just repeats. This would be another 4. So you have 8 good, and then he has this one. And it looks like it's a disjunctive syllogism, right? Oh, and this is the trick. You're going to love this. Remember how I said premise 2 has to have a tilde? Well, it does, but it's not denying this. In order to deny that, you have to have another tilde, which would be the negation rule that we just looked at. So watch this. So long story short, this is invalid because there's no negation on the second line. You might say, well, Joseph, you told me if there's a tilde. Yeah, I did, but it's got to be negating something up here. All that's doing is affirming the same thing you have. So this is how you would negate it. This is what you would need for that to be valid. In order to make this into a disjunctive syllogism valid, what would I need to do to line 2? Anybody see that? Not A. That would be the same thing as saying A, and A is a contradiction to not A. So again, this not A would be the same thing as A, and that would be negating the not A up there. Therefore, I cancel out these, and I bring down my B. Everybody see that? Okay. Rewind the video if you don't. Well, I'll do it with another letter, just in case some of you didn't. What would I have to do to deny that? Not C. Then I can bring down my D. Therefore, those cancel out. Bring down my D. Okay? Because why? Not C is the same thing as C. And C cancels out the not C. Okay. So there's a review of his forms. And there we go. We are finally at the homework. So let's go down here. So on 1, depending on what kind of homework you have, interpret the following, symbols in light of the 8 argument forms presented, and then basically, what form is this? Is it a valid form? If so, what name is it? Is it invalid? Give me the name. Is it invalid but doesn't have a name? No problem. Give me, just put invalid. So here's how this works. You're going to have choices. You're going to have to give me the name. Oh, sorry. Pens. You're going to have to give me name if it's valid, name if it's invalid, or invalid with no name. Okay, so look at this one. And if some of you want to do these and push pause, because I'm just going to fly through them. But you can push pause, think through yourself, go back, look at the previous examples, and try to work them out yourself. Because remember, the way to get good at these is practice. So we have an N. So we have premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. So I have if N, then C, not C, therefore not N. What does that look like? Modus, tollens, valid. Okay? If you got stuck on that, go back and look at those 2 examples. What do I mean by 2 examples? Look at these. Go up where Hurley gives you either this, because he gives you forms that you can look at, or you scroll all the way up and you can see them here. Summary and application, right? So you got those 2 sections. Either one are good. Or you can go and look at them individually if you want. You can scroll all the way up and look at each individual form. But either way. Okay, so number 4. It's a long one, right? How many propositions does it have? SPD. Does it have, okay, so remember on this slide, oops, I'm going to delete that bad boy. remember what we're looking for up here, we have this separated by that. And then down below, it seems to be affirming your antecedents, and then it affirms the consequence. What's that? Constructive dilemma, valid. Again, you can look at these, okay? You can go back and look at them. But I'm assuming you've pushed pause, kind of thought about it yourself. So you saw the pattern, and that's why I did this. That's why I stuck this over here. You saw two horseshoes, your dot. You saw a wedge down below it. You saw another wedge for your conclusion. So you have what looks to be the makings of a constructive dilemma. Then you actually have to just see, well, does it do what the constructive dilemma does? Yes, it does. So let's go to 7. These are all given to you in the back of the book of your mind tab, by the way. So 7. If you wanted to see this, is a... Oh. What does it do? It has two horseshoes separated by a wedge, En, L, K, and then what it does is it denies the consequences. And it doesn't look like this second one's denying, but it is. It's taking the opposite. And then it's denying the antecedents. So another way to see this with that double negation rule would be this. Now it has to, now that's the first premise, right? Second premise has to deny the consequence, right? So I have a K. So over here, I'm denying this, right? But to truly deny that, I could say not K. That would be the same thing as saying K. So either one. You could say not K, and then, or, you know, as over example, K. So some of us can see one or the other. You don't need to write out not K. You just know that K is the opposite of this. But logically speaking, in order to technically be right, you have to put not K or whatever. So once you do that, you can properly deny the antecedents. Okay, so there you go. Moving on to 10. Oops. Oh, man, I don't know what was happening there. Okay. Oh, it says words not responding. Give me a second. Okay. There we go. Let's go to 10. Okay, so this one you can stop if you want, but this one is denying the antecedent. Antecedent, that's invalid. There you go. So why? Because you're not allowed to do that. You can look up at those forms and find out how they matched. Let's go to 13. 13, what was this one? This was simply disjunctive syllogism. Why? I have premise 1 here, premise 2, conclusion. It looks like I'm denying one of those options, so I'm bringing the other down. And you could see this like this. You could see it like this. And again, Hurley throws in that rule like the double negation. So technically, in order to negate the not S, you're supposed to put not S, which is the same thing as S. It's the same thing. Then you can technically cross those out and bring down the P. But either way, if you didn't put not on S, it's fine. You know that S simply contradicts not S. Okay? So moving along, let's do 16. 16, if you want to push pause and think about it and then come back, it is affirming the consequent. invalid, meaning not G, therefore K. So I'm going to affirm K in the second line or the second premise. Then I'm going to conclude my not G. Can't do that. Okay, so that's for your part 1 homework. Oh, we have one more, 19. Now let's see, does this fit the model? It looks like we have 3 horseshoes. Looks like a hypothetical syllogism, right? Now you have to find out, is it like, go back, you can use any letters you want. Does it look something like that? And it turns out, no, you don't have something that connects. So anyways, you could look at my example. You don't have something that connects here. So you can't affirm your A and your C down on the bottom of the conclusion. So you have 3 conditionals. It looks like a hypothetical syllogism, but you need more. You need another connection that I just showed you that you don't have. So it's invalid. And the purpose is not just to give you the right answers for these homeworks, just to show you why something's lacking. And again, if you want to know why these are valid or invalid, you could do truth tables on them. You just don't have to. You already know that if you were to have done those, they would be valid or invalid. Right now, you're just trying to recognize the forms. Pattern recognition, okay? That's what 6.6 is all about. Oops. Okay, so let me do this. Now, let's say part 2 in your homework is a little bit more complicated because now you got to do exactly what I just did, but you've got to translate first. Oh, how hard. But the cool thing about this edition of Hurley is that he actually gives you the propositions. He's making it easy on you. He's saying, look, only 2 propositions, translate. And on some of the other examples, you'll see, they'll give you exactly the letters to use. So in these, I'm actually going to fly through these. I'm going to simply write down the answers, but I'm going to give you a little bit of time to figure out why. So let's just do part 1. Okay, so I won't read it to you. You can push pause. I will just map it out. And again, if you want to struggle through these, that's how you'll get better. And what do we find out when we do this? Again, I'm using B and G because he's telling me to. And I'm using not G because it's not the case that 2 giant engines. So you can go through these one by one. These line up, that lines up. So that's Modus tollens. Valid. And in order for you to find out it's Modus tollens, you have to number 1 translate, and then number 2 find out what form it is. Okay, if it doesn't have a specific form, and as far as this chapter, then it's invalid. So it's either valid or invalid. You're only given those 2 options. Okay, so that's the easy part. Number 4, you can push pause. Just as a hint, we have 2 propositions, so it's going to limit our number of forms. That's not going to be a constructive or destructive dilemma. I am looking at either or, so that's going to eliminate using the conditionals, things like that, little hints, little triggers. So this one will simply be so this one is disjunctive syllogism, valid. What am I doing? Premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. I have a W, and premise 2, I'm denying that W, so these cross out. Therefore, I bring him down. Done. Easy, right? You have 2 choices. You negate one, you have the other. Let's do 7. 7. Okay, so if we were to read it as it is and translate it exactly how we read it, it would look like this. Now, some of you can see the form right away and some of you can't. This happens to be a modus ponens. So something else is going on. You might say, yeah, but Joseph, when I see a modus ponens, I see it like this. Because you down in chapter 1, sorry, that's a sloppy little letter right there. Okay, so and B, and then we have and. So that's the way you've seen it. You've seen the conditional on premise 1. and then you're affirming on premise 2, conclusion to bring it down. So notice, this is option 1. Option 1. Option 2. And what have I done? All I've done was reverse premise 1 and 2. Are they logically the same? Yes. There is no difference. But the way that you translate it out, when you have over here, when you do your premise 1, and you see the end, premise 2, you might not recognize that form. So what I would tell you is, if some of you translate it this way, reverse premise 1 and 2, look at it this way, and then tell me, now do you recognize the form? Because if you do, you would see it's modus ponens. So you simply flip premise 1 and 2. Okay, so in other words, could I say, instead of starting with this, which represents this, could I start with this? Could I start with, if that is so, then, meaning, so the way I see it, I see premise 1 here, premise 2, right? And I see my conclusion. I could start with premise 2, but I would have to take the but away. If I were to translate this in, I would just say, if that is so. So I'd have to do a little restructuring in my English, but I could put that premise up on front, like I do here, right? In option 2. It's just that the author chooses option 1. He wants to discuss the English this way. Okay? The bottom line with all that is you can swap premises. It's still the same structure. It's still a modus ponens here, and it's still a modus ponens there. Again, you might see this with the other different argument forms. All 8 could be reverse premise, still the same. Okay? Logically the same. So let's do 10. 10. We know we have how many propositions? 4. That looks like it's going to limit us right down to whether it's going to be a constructive or destructive dilemma. Possibly. We don't know, right? But you have to map it out, and here we go. Okay, so long story short, this is invalid. It is not a destructive or constructive dilemma because it's not being consistent with what they did. This one, I have what looks to be, so at first glance, premise 1 looks like it would be all right. It could be a constructive destructive dilemma, right? It has the right features. It has horseshoes. It has a conjunction symbol. And this one, so here's where the error comes in. On the destructive and constructive dilemma, it has a wedge on both. This has conjunction. Boom. So somewhere along the line, if I were to map that out, because that's how I translate it, by the way. The translation, that is correct. Oops, let me not confuse you. Translation's correct. It's just that once you translate it and you see the symbols, there's something missing, because the constructive, destructive, like I said, they're using different symbols on premise 2 and the conclusion. They have wedges. This one has conjunction. So it's invalid. Doesn't work. And you could see, by the way, you would see that if you did, that's what I was trying to tell you before, you would see that if you tried to do a truth table, it's 4 propositions, it would be 16 lines. You would see that somewhere on that truth table, you'd have 2 true premises and you would have a false conclusion. That's why it's invalid. It's just that you don't have to do all that work here. Again, we're just recognizing the forms that Hurley gave us. There's 6 good, 2 bad. 13. So this one, I'm just going to write this one out pretty fast. I'll be down in a minute. I'll be down in 30 seconds. Give me a second. Sorry. This one. So, simply, this is destructive dilemma, valid. And you could rewrite this using commutativity and double negation, which I haven't done here, but you could if you wanted to. So basically, that's it for this chapter with your homework. Recognize the forms. Are they good? Are they bad? If they have names, let me know the names. But on part 2, a little bit harder because you have to translate. Okay, if you have any questions, just let me know.